report.
Tonight, why Foreign Minister Penny Wong and the Labour left are playing into the hands of Hamas terrorists. It's disgraceful. No wonder Jews here are so frightened. And we'll cross to Israel for the latest in its controversial attack on a hospital in Gaza and ask what Israel's critics like Wong will not. What has made that such a target? Also tonight, behind the immigration disaster that has the Albanese government letting free some 80 foreigners in detention, including an assassin and a pedophile, how the immigration system has been letting you down. Plus, global warming guru Greta Thunberg is confronted at a rally over the weekend over a political extremism. But first, a perfect example of why the green energy revolution of this government is becoming a massive disaster, another embarrassment. And what this one exposes is what the Voice referendum did too. A Prime Minister who isn't across the details, who is a dreamer, who cannot see the facts in front of his face. Be worried. Now, by the way, just how much of a dreamer Albanese is, we already saw again last week when he agreed to a deal at the Pacific Islands Forum to let up to 280 people a year come from Tuvalu to live here in Australia as climate refugees, fleeing islands supposedly drowning under rising seas.
As a low-lying nation that's particularly impacted its very existence by the threat of climate change.
But Albanese was conned, or maybe he's conned himself, because this deal is ridiculous. Reason? Tuvalu is not, in fact, drowning. The most up-to-date study by scientists at Auckland University found there had instead been a net increase in land of more than 73 hectares over the past 40 years. Tuvalu actually got 2.9% bigger despite sea level rise, it said. And that's because waves tend to deposit coral and other sediment on low-lying coral atolls. The evidence is quite clear. But Tuvalu has in fact been playing this drowning island shtick on suckers for years. And I reckon it's because there's big money in it. It's got a lot of aid as a result, including again from Albanese, aren't you surprised, by guilting naive Western leaders like him with lines like this.
The entire population of Tuvalu lives below 2 metres above sea level. I woke this morning and I was crying, and that's not easy for a grown man to admit. The fate of my country rests in your hands.
Well, I'm crying that Albanese could be such a sucker. I mean, explain to me why your Prime Minister is taking in climate refugees from islands that are actually growing, not sinking. I mean, how blinded by ideology do you have to be to do something like that? Well, stupid question. We saw just how blind with the Voice, didn't we? But Albanese's crusading on global warming is much more serious than bringing in another 280 Tuvaluans a year. And here we do get to his latest embarrassment. Now, already the Prime Minister's massive plan to replace most of our coal-fired electricity by solar and wind in just 7 years is a disaster that's forcing up electricity prices and leaving us short of power. But he also has a plan to make Australians buy more electric cars. In fact, the plan is half of all new car sales electric by 2030. Incredible. By forcing gassier and cheaper cars out of the market. Driving will be a luxury. Albanese has been so keen on electric cars and the recharges that they're going to need all around the country that he kept visiting again and again a Queensland plant called Tritium that makes recharges, claiming that this was a fabulous business and he had a plan to spend government money on things just like this.
The truth is that the future is right here at Tritium. What we haven't always been good at is commercialising the opportunities which are there. And our Powering Australia plan is about doing just that. It's about seizing the opportunity that is there to deal with climate change.
And just a few months ago, Albanese was at that Tritium company again, selling it and its recharges as our future, the kind of thing he had planned for.
This is my third visit to Tritium. Every time I come back, I hear about more revenue, more jobs being created, more countries where Australia is exporting to. This is a great success story here, and I congratulate everyone here at Tritium for their achievement.
If those women behind him didn't look so convinced, maybe they knew something that he didn't, because all this shows that Albanese's got no business smarts at all and should not be in the business of splashing your money on his pet global warming schemes. How often does that have to be said? Government and business decisions do not mix. You see, Tritium has in fact lost an absolute fortune. And last week said would have to now close its Brisbane factory, the one he said was our future. More than 200 jobs gone. And it's going to move to the United States to try to cut costs. Now, analysts say, well, look, this could be a real long shot because Tritium could actually be in a death spiral. Shares have sunk from $10 US to just 24 cents. So when Albanese tells you that a green scheme is doing brilliantly, count your fingers. You could be very well dreaming yet again, like he did with The Voice, like he did with saving people from drowning islands, and like he's now doing with his energy revolution. And the bill for those dreams, when they turn into nightmares, I've got to warn you, they tend to go to you. But big news, big news. I'm going to defend the Albanese government now on something that looked very suspicious. It was, in fact, looking like a scandal. It's been getting a lot of heat on this, but it might just have made the right call, if for the wrong reasons. The government has just blocked a Freedom of Information request from Sky News for documents on its very controversial decision to block a request from Qatar Airways to put on an extra 28 flights a week. Which would have hurt Qantas, which has been close to Labor, that people were smelling something suspicious here, but it would have helped you by cutting international airfares. Now, the document that Sky News was after is advice the Transport Government gave its Minister, Catherine King, in January, 6 months before she did decide to ban those extra Qatar flights. The Department's Freedom of Information decision-maker now says, well, we can't see that advice because, he says, or she, there is a reasonable expectation that the release of material in the document would disclose information about international relations with Qatar. And if this information were made publicly available, it would have the capacity to prejudice or undermine the Australian government's relations with Qatar. Now, up to now, Minister King has been all over the shop in coming up with excuses for having banned these extra Qatar flights, like it was for Australian jobs and give Qantas a break, had just bought expensive planes. Oh, because she wanted to decarbonise air travel. That one was a real side splitter. Now, while all that shilly-shallying is still very suspicious and raises real questions over the competence of Catherine King, there is now an excellent reason to actually ban Qatar. A reason that would upset Qatar if our government said it out loud. And it's this. Did you know Qatar actually helps the Hamas terrorist group, which attacked Israel last month and started this horrible war? In fact, the top leader of Hamas is allowed to keep his headquarters in the safety of Qatar. In contrast, Qantas's partner in the Middle East, Emirates, is owned by the United Arab Emirates, which condemned Hamas and signed a deal with Israel to normalise relations. Qatar has actually defended Hamas. So, I think it's crystal clear. We must reward Emirates and ban Qatar if we want peace in the Middle East. And whatever reason the government's been giving, well, banning Qatar is the right thing to do. Joining me is the panel, Michael Kroger, former Victorian Liberal President, Steve Conroy, former Labor Senator and Cabinet Minister. Michael, Qatar Airways, owned by the Qatari government, and as I just said, helps Hamas. Does that end this whole political controversy about the government banning the rest of Qatar flights? Because I don't know that the opposition should, as it did today, keep trying to chase this particular rabbit.
Well, Andrew, if that's the reason they didn't agree to the extra flights, good on the Albanese government. I think that's a perfectly laudable reason for not extending their access to Australian airports if it's for the reason that they are sponsors of the leadership of Hamas in Qatar. So if that is the reason, big tick.
No, my point isn't whether it's for their reason or not. They could have made an absolutely stupid decision. But given that it does sponsor Hamas, then that's it. I mean, no extra flights for Qatar. Let's reward Emirates instead. But Steve, I've got one for you. Why has the Prime Minister just agreed to take in 280 climate refugees each year from Tuvalu when their islands are actually growing, not drowning?
Well, look, Andrew, I know this is hard and you've had a long, consistent position on climate change, but the Pacific Island nations don't agree with you. And
I'm talking science, I'm talking facts.
There is a significant issues, but not just around climate change in the Pacific Islands. As you know, China have been attempting to buy, bribe, coerce their way into influencing these Pacific nations. So when Penny Wong, Pat Conroy, Richard Marles, Tim Watts, all are ministers and assistant ministers who deal with the Pacific Islands, have conversations to ensure that they're not going to, like the Solomon Islands, and go, say, no, you're wrong, we don't agree with you. They're not opening the door for China. So when these countries put their views on the table, we don't have the luxury of doing what you do, Andrew, and saying, you're wrong, you're stupid, we don't agree with you, science proves that you are wrong. You sit down and you listen to the concerns and you want to build a set of relationships that are strong and robust. And then as long as this is being done on an individual basis, country, island, individually, and not a sort of falling into a broader definition.
Stephen, you make it sound like
I think it's
you make it sound like it's up in dispute that Tuvalu is growing or not, or sinking. It is in fact not in dispute. It's got bigger. Even Tuvalu will admit it's got bigger.
I haven't done the measure.
Is again, well, believe me, the top expert in this field has, and it's been out there for 5 years. It's not challenged. In fact, it's been backed up by French research. It's got bigger. Most islands, in fact, low-lying atoll islands have been getting bigger. 42% are getting bigger, 42% are being stable, 16 just are shrinking. Michael, the point is, you can keep China out. I don't mind handing money to Tuvalu, but don't lie about it. Give them a hospital. Give them a new school. Don't feed a lie that has legs back here.
Well, Andrew, there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the Labor pollsters and hardheads are, dancing in the streets tonight, knowing full well that Albo taking climate refugees from a nation that's growing in size will do an enormous amount for his poll ratings, given that cost of living in Australia is the #1 issue. So they'll be euphoric that Albo's absolutely hit a home run in the last few days on an issue of no concern to a single Australian, for goodness sake, mate. Yes, of course, build them a hospital, provide security, provide something education-wise, whatever. But this was just, and I haven't been critical of his overseas trips at all, but I think this might have been one trip that he could have avoided, quite frankly.
Now, something that's really scared me, Stephen, so many Jewish Australians have been contacting me in despair of the Jew hatred they've seen now. I don't know of one that hasn't said it's been the worst now that it's ever been in their lives. On the weekend, we had one Islamist extremist lead a pro-Palestinian motorbike rally, escorted by police, if you don't mind, escorting them through heavily Jewish areas of Sydney in an intimidation run. In Melbourne, more than 100, some say 200 Muslim pro-Palestinian protesters rallied in a park in the very Jewish suburb of Caulfield, right opposite a synagogue, and abused and insulted and even fought Jews there. Later, about 10 of them jumped some Jews leaving their car and punched them after demanding to see if they'd been taking photographs of them. An elderly Jewish man with an Israeli flag riding a bike in Chapel Street was knocked down and kicked. I mean, seriously. But where is our Prime Minister? Where is the Foreign Minister instead of giving lectures to Israel?
Well, I don't agree with the last part of your premise, but I want to absolutely agree with everything you said in that first part. This is disgusting behaviour. This is pure and simple intimidation. There is not anyone in this country who is fooled that this is expressing a right to free speech. Melbourne in particular, Andrew, you'd know we have protests all the time on a variety of issues that you would agree with some, I would agree with some, I'd disagree with some. And we have an orderly process, particularly in Melbourne, and people know there's areas where you go to protest. So to try and play cute that this was just an accident, they happened to pick a park in Caulfield, is just not to be accepted. That is not credible, and people need to call it out for what it was, an attempt to intimidate the Jewish community. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable to decide you're going to have a charity convoy and decide to ride through the streets of the main Jewish areas.
Mate, you're speaking beautifully. You are speaking beautifully. Where's the Prime Minister giving the leadership?
Importantly, Chris Minns has announced today that he is going to beef up the laws that exist at the moment to deal with hate speech. We've seen the preacher who
Chris Minns, big tick.
some outrageous...
I agree with you. My question was the Prime Minister.
Yeah, but I'm going to disagree with your premise here. The Prime Minister has been very clear. He is absolutely opposed and has called out the Hamas behaviour. He is absolutely made clear that we support the state of Israel and its right to exist. What we have at the moment, Michael, is people who want to associate with the Hamas crew, who want to walk next to people who say things like
so let me put
from
it
the
to
river
Michael.
to the sea.
Now, let me put it to Michael, Stephen. That wasn't my question, but let me put it to Michael. Michael, the Prime Minister, yes, has condemned Hamas. Great. Who hasn't?
No.
But giving leadership when Jews
the Greens,
in this country
for a start, let's be clear, the Greens haven't.
And abused and attacked.
So, Andrew, there are two Labor parties. You've got the descendants of Bob Hawke, who are Shorten and Marles and you, Stephen, and Don Farrell and the sensible people in the centre-right. And then you've got the descendants of Bill Hartley, the old Labor left-wing pro-Palestinian ratbag from Victoria, and they are the socialist left. And I'm sorry to say, in the socialist left of the Labor Party are Albanese and Wong, and they are not friends of Israel, despite what they say. And for her call yesterday to let's move towards a ceasefire. I mean, Andrew, no one supports Hamas worldwide. Why are they still there?
Michael,
why are they still there?
That is not true.
Where are the I'm sorry, that she said we need to settle the conditions for a ceasefire.
She said we need.
But Andrew, the big issue, Andrew, is where are the Western leaders? Where is forget about Wong and Albanese. Look, where's Biden and the French president and the British? Why aren't they calling for Hamas to surrender? I mean, the whole issue is about Israel and these hospitals that they're not attacking. Where is Biden saying Hamas? No one in the world supports you except for Iran. Why are you still there? If the Palestinian people don't support Hamas, Andrew, why are they still there? Because of the weakness of the West we see. All you need to do with the West is start an argument. The West will get upset. About 2 weeks later, they collapse, like the Republicans in America are giving up on the Ukraine, which is appalling. All Biden needs to do is saying
Hamas is
there needs to be a surrender.
In Gaza.
Laughing.
They're sitting in their tunnels in Gaza, like Hitler was sitting in his bunker in Berlin.
Yeah, correct.
While bombs are flying around. They'd rather their country were destroyed than surrender. If they had any care for their people, they would surrender. But they don't.
And they don't, Andrew.
And I tell you, the people on the street calling for a ceasefire, why aren't they calling for surrender Hamas? They say, oh, we don't support Hamas. That's not the same as the people, the Palestinians. Well, then you've got no problem, have you, in calling for the surrender of a genocidal bunch of fascists and terrorists who are running a police state and killing Jews at the drop of a hat. I mean, seriously. Michael Kroger, Steve Conroy, thank you both for your time. Really appreciate it. Speaking about all that, Penny Wong, as Michael said, yesterday did a very stupid thing. Said something that helps the Hamas terrorists and hurts Israel. First, she said Israel and Hamas should take steps together to work for a ceasefire, something that another Labor Minister, Ann Ali, a Muslim, was even more red hot for today, even though a ceasefire is exactly what Hamas wants, to buy time to regroup and whip up international pressure on Israel to pull out.
It doesn't mean that Hamas would not spend that time rearming.
That's a difficult point that you make. That's why this issue is so vexed, because you have two parties who are unrelenting.
Do you put them on the same level?
You put them on...
One is a terror group, according to
and one is a fully militarised, a state with a full military.
No to moral equivalence. Israel, Hamas, both bad. Seriously. The thing is, there was a ceasefire, of course. Right up to October 6th, there was a ceasefire, and Hamas broke it by slaughtering 1,200 Jews. And Hamas says it'll keep attacking Israel forever. So ceasefire is what it wants, so it gets that chance. But here was something even dumber that Wong said, effectively accusing Israel falsely of war crimes.
I would make this point in relation to hospitals and medical facilities, that international humanitarian law does require the protection of hospitals, of patients and of medical staff. And we do call on Israel to cease the attacking of hospitals. These are facilities protected under international law.
This is ridiculous. Hamas terrorists have actually been filmed shooting from hospitals. Why else would Israel be shooting back? And Israel has long insisted the biggest hospital, Al-Shifa, includes a Hamas headquarters and tunnels underneath. And that actually makes it a legitimate military target under international law. And Israel's been getting staff and patients at Shifa to leave before it does attack. In fact, one medical worker says they have left. Well, empty is not actually right. Hamas wouldn't want it empty of human shields, and there are obviously some staff there. But Wong is very wrong to say that no hospital should be attacked when Hamas has turned this one, for instance, into a military fortress, and then accusing Israel baselessly of war crimes. Just stokes up more of this anti-Jewish hysteria we've got on our streets. Joining me from Tel Aviv is Lieutenant Colonel Amnon Scheffler of the Israel Defense Forces. Lieutenant Colonel, thank you so much for your time. How many people do you guess are still at the Shifa hospital?
Andrew, thank you for having us. We assess that there are still people inside. And as you mentioned, we're doing everything for weeks, calling them and all the Gazan citizens to leave to the south. We have allowed 2 corridors in order to do that. We're taking tactical pauses in order to do that. And we're continuously calling and text messaging and telling everyone to please move to the south, which is a safer area.
Now, what assets does Hamas have at this hospital that you know of, and how do you know it?
We have very strong evidence, intel, and also now in the ground. And we have shared this also with our partners around the world that have also affirmed this. Hamas is using these hospitals as their headquarters. They are hiding underneath weaponry, similarly like they're doing in schools, under kindergartens, and in many civilian areas, because they deliberately use those spaces, knowing that we follow our values and the rule of armed conflict, and refrain from striking those areas whenever that is possible. But as again you mentioned, and we have shown many times, Hamas is continuously using these to launch more attacks on Israeli civilians. We have now getting close to 10,000 rockets that have been fired at Israelis, and much of them come from within the hospitals where they are controlled and commanded. And that is why we need to get to them eventually. But we're trying to do that in the safest way for the civilians in Gaza.
Now, Hamas health officials are saying there's no power at Shifa Hospital and babies are dying. They've all been taken off incubators, they say. Although the photos, and I'm not going to show them on the air, it's a bit distressing. The photos have seen the lights are still on, for the photographer at least. So there does seem to be some power, but nobody wants to see babies die. So what does Israel do?
Nobody wants to see babies die on our side and on the civilized world. Sadly, Hamas does. That is why they have murdered babies in Israel, and that is why they wish to continue doing that. Because we believe that every life is sanctuary, and we need to do everything in order to do that, we have offered for the evacuation of the babies in many different ways. And we're continuously doing that. Sadly, the Hamas is not allowing that, as it did not allow the evacuation of other civilians from the area. Yesterday, we even took the risk of our soldiers bringing fuel to the hospital in order to continue in operating it in the best possible way for these babies and others to be as safe as possible. And so far, they're not taking that fuel. So we're doing everything in order to help those babies and others in need to be safe.
Now, hostages, there was talk of Hamas letting a few more go, half of them American hostages, dual citizens. Where are those talks up to?
So we're in day 38 with 239 hostages and dozens more that are still unaccounted for. And we're working in any way that we can in order to bring them back home safely, be it Americans or any other nationality. This is our main mission, including the mission to dismantle Hamas.
But I take it those talks have broken down. It seemed that Hamas was stringing it out, hoping to buy some pressure for a ceasefire. There's been no progress, I take it then.
We're following through on all different routes. The military is, of course, doing its work on the ground and from the air and the sea. And the diplomats are doing everything that they can in order for us to bring home these civilians that we must, again, remember that they haven't been visited by Red Cross or anyone else. And that is what they should be, treated properly in the best way and released safely home now.
Lieutenant Colonel Amnon Scheffler, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Must be unbelievable days you're putting in there. Thank you so much indeed for your time. After the break, the Albanese government is forced to let out 80 foreigners, many alleged refugees, who committed serious crimes, including child rape and assassination. But how slack were we to let them in the first place? And let in some of the protesters now on our streets hunting Jews. How about that? A top immigration expert on these disasters after this. You know, when I see the hate that we've imported in the Middle East now spread out into our streets, I'm thinking, the immigration system sure made a lot of mistakes. And that's particularly true with our refugee program, as we're discovering right now. The High Court has just overturned 2 decades of precedent and said to the Albanese government, well, you can't now keep foreign citizens indefinitely in jail, even if they've committed terrible crimes and their home country won't take them back or could give them the death penalty. You know, you've got to let them go. I can see the point to some extent. So the government's been forced all of a sudden, without preparing for it apparently, to release more than 80 criminals, including a child rapist and also a Malaysian hitman who assassinated a young woman. Now, if that's not bad enough, the Immigration Minister today, Andrew Giles, couldn't or wouldn't say exactly what he'd done to make sure you were being kept safe.
Community safety has been our #1 priority in anticipation of the decision and since it's been handed down. So I want to reassure your listeners that from day one, the AFP and Border Force have been working closely with state and territory authorities while we consider all measures that may be available to ensure community protection.
See him reading his spin notes there. That's all he would give. I heard him again and again being asked, but what actually are you doing? Reading the notes, blah, blah, blah. It was just ridiculous. The opposition spokesman wouldn't have been the only person not impressed.
The type of people who are being released into the community are child sex abusers, people who have been murderers, hitmen, other people who have had aggravated violence against other people. What is being done to keep the community safe?
But there are actually 2 issues here, and it's not just what the government is going to do about this mess, but why were these people led into the country in the first place? Joining me is Simon Jeans, a former member of the Refugee Review Tribunal and now principal of Jeans Lawyers, which specialises in immigration law. Simon, always great to catch up with you. How on earth did we end up with all these people that the government must now free from indefinite detention? I mean, have we been too slack in the kind of people we do let in and claim refugee status?
Well, the people that we're talking about have often been in detention for over 10 years. So there's two groups of people we're talking about. The first group came in under Kevin Rudd's open border policy between 2009 and 2013, and that is the largest group of people. And so we really didn't have much choice. We couldn't screen them before they came because they came on boats, and at the time it was before they were sent to Nauru, so they were processed in Australia. And then, as it turned out, they were found by ASIO to be threats to national security. You've got one person who was a member of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad organisation, which is a proscribed terrorist group. And then other people were released into the community but committed serious assaults. The case you referred to of the child rapist, which is the subject of the recent recent case, he came in, I think, in September 2012 on a boat. So you've got that group of people. Then there's another group which are coming in by visa and then engaging, such as a tourist visa or a partner visa, and then staying in Australia and engaging in criminal or terrorism activities.
But honestly, what do we do with these people? What should the government now do with this particular problem? These 80 people who, through the slackness of the Rudd government, came in without a screening, and now these others that you mentioned too. How do we fix this so that well, I don't know, you can't keep them in prison indefinitely. I guess the government should have planned for this in the first place, that you can't keep them there for 30 years, can you?
No. Well, I mean, the system really started back in 1992. That's when the laws came in relation to mandatory detention, and that's been upheld by the High Court ever since last week. But there's lots of things the government can do to protect the community. So if they have to grant them a visa, they can put conditions on them, such as you have to reside in a particular place. And they could make that place Christmas Island. They could make it an uninhabited island where we build them a complete, refugee camp for them to live. There are a number of controls that we can have, but that's probably the main control. We can control where they live. So they don't have to necessarily move back into the main cities and just disappear among people or disappear amongst the community, because they'll simply be impossible to monitor. The police and security forces just don't have the resources to follow everyone. They can also pass legislation to say that if you have been unfairly detained, your maximum compensation is $1. So rather than pay out millions of dollars, as the Solicitor General foreshadowed, they can limit that. And that was done in the early 1990s with some Cambodian boat arrivals. They can also, what I would also do is I'd do a reassessment of their protection visa claims, because a lot of them may not be refugees, but the system that the Department of Immigration or Home Affairs uses is not what I would describe as particularly. It's not really good. It's pretty slack, in fact, and they accept a large number of people who are not refugees.
I love some of those ideas. But I tell you what, our refugee system has to also now start to include there's whole countries that are so safe, so democratic, and all that. We don't accept any refugee claim from those countries, and just sort of end some of this farce. Simon Jeans, always great to catch up with you. Great ideas there. Thank you for your time. After the break, tonight, a documentary on how the Liberals tore themselves apart, that whole Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison stab fest, and the lessons learned. And one lesson, what mugs the Liberals were, to pick a Turnbull as a leader. That sort of mistake, never again. I'll talk to someone who actually worked for that destructive man. Straight after this show, we'll run the first of a two-part documentary on the turmoil in the Liberal Party that led to its defeat in last year's election. And one of the themes that comes out is how many Liberal politicians now regret what I said on day one would be a disaster. I couldn't believe the two Liberals would be so stupid as to make Malcolm Turnbull, a self-obsessed and out-of-touch global warming alarmist of the left, their leader, after he plotted to depose Tony Abbott as Prime Minister. This documentary shows a lot of buyer's remorse.
Was Malcolm Turnbull being treacherous? If you challenge a leader, obviously you're not being supportive of them.
I do regret backing Malcolm Turnbull, and I feel sorry for Malcolm Turnbull that he fails to understand that the trust that was put in him by the party membership, not just in Queensland, but across Australia, that he failed to understand that trust, and that he has actually returned that trust with his continuing acts of disloyalty to the party and, more importantly, to the members of the party.
Well, it was actually Turnbull's former Chief of Staff who made tonight's documentary, Sky News host Chris Kenny. Chris Kenny, thanks for joining me. Your documentary tonight, you talked to a lot of the players in the Liberal Party, also a few Nats as well. Were there any who had a good word for Malcolm Turnbull?
Surprisingly, Andrew, when you consider what Turnbull did to the coalition during that period of government, some of them do have some good things to say about him. I mean, John Howard, for instance, was at pains to say something good about each three of the Prime Ministers. And the current Deputy Liberal leader, Susan Ley, she talks about Turnbull being, what was her word, idiosyncratic and mercurial, which I thought was a delightful way of describing Malcolm Turnbull. But there are a couple of interviews, I think, that really get to the point with Malcolm Turnbull. One is Senator James McGrath, the Queensland senator who's still in the parliament, and he was one of the key numbers men who put Turnbull in place, who tore down Tony Abbott and installed Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister. He now says that's a mistake. He's honest and upfront and says that was the wrong thing to do and it was a mistake. Turnbull was a bad Prime Minister and he's bad for the Liberal Party now with the vengeance he's been seeking. And the other politician or former politician who talks in detail and opens up about Malcolm Turnbull is Alan Tudge, of course, who has left politics now but was caught up in that scandal thanks to a ABC Four Corners Canberra bubble expose in which Malcolm Turnbull played a role. He gave interviews to the ABC and worked with them on that expose, and that, of course, cost Alan Tudge his position as a minister. And Alan Tudge says that Malcolm Turnbull, to this day, is seeking political revenge in the public space against all those people who voted against him in 2018 when he lost the Prime Ministership. So he talks about Turnbull still being vengeful all these years on.
Yeah, but what gets me is how the Liberals, and maybe this is part of your whole series too, Chris, had so forgotten what they stood for that they chose this guy to be their leader, someone of the left, someone who wasn't committed to the party, someone who tried to be of the Labor Party early on, a global warming zealot. Why they thought this was a good idea and that it wouldn't end as ugly as it did absolutely had me beat from day one.
Yeah, I think part of the answer, Andrew, is that so many of them came into politics, came into Parliament at 2013. They hadn't experienced Malcolm Turnbull as leader back in 2009 when I worked for him and he lost the leadership to a challenge then from Tony Abbott. So they hadn't seen what he was like. So they were beguiled by his promise. And yes, some of them were sort of lefty liberals. They're into the climate change stuff. But they really were convinced that Malcolm Turnbull was this sort of messiah who could give them a fresh modern image, and they just didn't understand because they hadn't really worked closely with him. You would have thought that anybody who had experienced Turnbull as opposition leader back in 2008 and 2009 couldn't have voted that way, but they did, and some at least are honest enough, like James McGrath, to admit that it was a terrible mistake.
But is that the overall theme of your two-part series? Because I haven't seen all of it yet. That you had a party in such turmoil that it went from Tony Abbott, quite conservative, to Malcolm Turnbull, way out on the left, to Scott Morrison, who, well, said he was conservative but really wasn't. Yeah, they were all over the ideological shop in just 5 years of turmoil and backstabbing.
Yeah, and it was all really down to Turnbull, wasn't it? Because you had a Conservative Prime Minister and it was the moderate, the left Liberal Prime Minister who tore him down. And then again, it was a Conservative in Peter Dutton who sought to reclaim the party, and he was sort of pipped by the compromise candidate in Scott Morrison. So I think the party, as you say, did go through this ideological sort of uphill and down dale over a condensed period. But I think the real question is how they even allowed this to start, right? That we'd seen the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years, the absolute turmoil, what that cost the Labor Party and what it cost the country. And Tony Abbott and the Coalition's big promise in 2013 was, we'll put that behind us. We'll go back to adult, mature, stable, responsible government. And that was the central promise of Tony Abbott. And, of course, he tried to deliver it. He made his mistakes, as all first-term Prime Ministers do. But once Malcolm Turnbull tore him down, then that was the Coalition really breaking their central pledge of stable, mature government. And from then on in, it was very, very difficult to recover. I kind of see Scott Morrison's Prime Ministership as that attempt to recover. It was triggered by Peter Dutton, but it was the party kind of reclaiming itself from the Turnbull years. But, you know, in the interim, you've got 3 terms, 3 Prime Ministers, so many opportunities lost. And now the Liberals in a really difficult situation right across mainland Australia, needing to find their mojo, find their values and chart a path back to power.
Yeah, but I wonder, I have the feeling that, you know, Peter Dutton sort of crab walked to it. And I don't want to re-prosecute the whole Voice thing, but with the Voice in particular, they found out that they can actually mount an argument and win it if they're committed enough to it, which is not what Morrison did, and it's certainly not what Turnbull did. They did not prosecute the big arguments. They surrendered on so much, and they lost the respect even of their own members. I wonder whether you see that as one of the things from, you know, your 2-part doco that they've learned, that they should actually fight for values and they might actually win.
Well, I hope so. Certainly that's the message that John Howard gives the party in his interview with me, which will be in tomorrow night's episode. And I agree with you. Now, we were on different sides of the Voice debate, but I agree with you that Peter Dutton showed that he could fight for a value he believed in. It was a courageous decision to oppose the Voice. We all know that it was a comfortable win for Peter Dutton in the end, but it didn't look like that many months out. So it was a very courageous decision for him to take this on. And he showed that he can campaign, at least in that negative way, he can campaign strongly. So I think the party's very united behind Peter Dutton now. The thing I would caution, though, is that defeating a referendum is that's the easy part of politics, right? As soon as it doesn't have bipartisan support, a referendum really should be defeated, and that's what transpired in this case. What we need Peter Dutton and the Coalition to do, and make sure they bring those left-leaning or moderate Liberals with them, is to fight hard on some of the central issues like climate and energy policy. You know, are they courageous enough to campaign against net zero by 2050? We know it's impossible. We know it can't happen. So why not scrap that promise of net zero by 2050? And what about economic management? Can they summon the courage to actually promise to deliver smaller government, to pull back on government spending? These I think, are central challenges for the Coalition. They need to grasp that nettle. It won't be as easy as defeating the Voice, but in many ways it'll be more important for the future of the country and the Coalition.
Chris Kenny, thank you so much. I really look forward to your show straight after I've finished tonight. Good on you.
Yeah, not long to go now, Andrew. I'm really looking forward to everyone seeing it.
After the break, Greta Thunberg confronted at a rally over one of the great weaknesses of radical leftists like her. Plus, British police learned that after anti-Israel comes anti-them. Global warming goddess Greta Thunberg has lost her cuteness now she's 20. Maybe to compensate, it's become even more politically radical. In fact, so radical that at a climate rally in Amsterdam on the weekend, one man in the crowd lost it when she turned it into a rally for Palestinians in Gaza.
We have not been listening. The people in power have not been listening.
I come here for a climate demonstration, not a political view.
Calm down. No climate justice on occupied land. No climate justice on occupied land.
Joining me from London is broadcaster and writer Esther Karaku. Esther, what we were seeing just there, to me, it wasn't just Thunberg searching for relevance, I suggest, but it's also that thing that you see in the left where you have to have a portfolio of causes. They all have to come together. I'll save your Wales if you save my racial handicap or something. I don't know.
Yes, what we're looking at there is a congregation of the mentally unwell, which nowadays every sort of movement devolves into. I cannot believe, I mean, I actually laughed when I saw this, that they were shouting no climate justice on occupied land, as if for any reason the concern of many Gazans right now is climate justice from the cloud gods of the IDF. I mean, it's just ludicrous. But what you see now, because Greta Thunberg's ideology is so inconsistent and so incoherent, is she now finds different things to attach herself to. So climate justice becomes racial justice, becomes trans justice, and becomes Islamist justice, and all the other justices she can possibly think of, because she's not a very intelligent person to listen to.
But, you know, it's like when you do it like that, I mean, there must be a lot of conservatives, a number of conservatives also worried about global warming, I guess, and a number of people that don't give two hoots about global warming that are concerned about Palestinians. But this way, it makes you have to tick off every box to belong. It becomes tribal rather than the issue.
Absolutely, and this is the issue here. Unfortunately for Greta Thunberg, this strategy is not only going to work, it's going to work a lot less well, because she's now 20, she's no longer the sort of adorable teenager that was being trotted around at UN conventions. She's a grown woman who should probably start looking for a job.
Esther, breaking news, Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, has been sacked. Tell us about that, because there was she's had a lot of criticism for criticising these pro-Palestinian demonstrations as hate rallies, for instance.
Yeah, so what we're hearing so far is that there's an imminent cabinet reshuffle, and in that, Suella Braverman will no longer continue in her role as the Home Secretary. I suspect she probably will still be in the cabinet to appease whatever Conservatives are left in the party, although I doubt that. What you're seeing now is Rishi Sunak caving to pressure. At the end of the day, Suella Braverman was largely right. You know, a lot of people during these Palestinian marches are hateful and anti-Semitic, and she made that point very clearly. She also made the point that the police clearly have double standards. You know, these are the same people that were happy to ban protests in 2011, but they didn't feel the need to ban this particular protest, even though there was evidence that was going to be incendiary, like it was on Armistice Day, which is extremely unfortunate and extremely disrespectful to the people who lost their lives in service of this country.
Well, what I find amazing, she's been sacked for saying they're hate rallies, and sacked also for saying, you know, that that the British police are being too gentle on the protesters. In fact, let me just show you exactly the confirmation. Huge protests against Israel again last weekend, including green smoke bombs being let off outside a synagogue, a Jewish home vandalised, and some protesters even yelling, "Death to all the Jews." And then you got British police being attacked with fireworks shot at them and chants of "F the police," etc., etc. I mean, seriously, isn't this just proof of what she said?
She's absolutely right. And the issue here is the public no longer has trust in the police, because this is the same police force that had a constable bending the knee at a BLM riot, that were happy to ban certain protests, but really easy on people literally shouting hateful things on the streets of our capital. So she was absolutely right in that respect. I suspect this is going to come back very badly on Rishi Sunak, and it's more than solidified the fact that the Conservatives are going to lose the next general election in a massive, massive way.
And she was a leadership candidate in the last runoff too, so she's probably polishing her CV for the next go.
Absolutely. I can see that happening.
Well, let's see. Esther, maybe you should polish your own up in a second. I know the cries for Esther for PM are growing louder and louder. Thank you so much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. And coming up next, of course, is that documentary I was talking about with Chris Kenny, Liberals in Power. I have to say, the Liberals seem to have learned a lesson now under the new leader, Peter Dutton, because he does seem to be bringing them slowly back to values-based stuff. Let's see if he does it with global warming. I tell you what, that is a rich field for the Liberals that has been untilled for too long. That's it from me. Coming up next, Liberals in Power. Good night.